All right, it looks like we're on live. I've done a sound check, and so I think this is working. I'm going to go ahead and wait just about another minute and a half, just to make sure that everyone is on okay, give people a chance to adjust whatever sound devices or other devices they have. So we'll just wait 1 sec. Just about another minute and we'll get started. All right, one more little check here. All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Stannard, if you don't already know me, and I'm Policy Director for Commonomics USA, as well as co-founder of the Materialized Empathy Project, a project of Commonomics USA. Just by way of kind of the way that we're going to proceed here today, after my initial presentation, which is not going to go, I don't think it's going to go a full hour. We will take questions from you all. There are a couple of ways that you can do that. One is that you can leave questions if you're watching this through YouTube, or if you don't want to finagle the Google Hangouts apparatus, you can ask the questions directly on our Facebook event page. We've started a thread on that Facebook event page for this event for questions and answers. And so after our initial presentation, I'll go ahead and look at those. The other thing is I have enabled the Q&A function on this Google Hangout. And so you can do that. And again, I will check both of those after the initial presentation. If you have questions that I can't answer, which is always really likely, I'm going to kick them over to our friends at Basic Income Action. That's an organization I'll tell you about in just a moment. They're really the go-to organization right now for the national movement in the United States to implement basic income, which is what we're going to talk about. So welcome. This is the first, I hope, of several of these types of events that Commonomics USA will host, sometimes through its Materialized Empathy Project, which is a policy project. Again, my name is Matt. For my own value system, the discussion about basic income intersects with a lot of important things. I feel like economic insecurity is one of the chief problems of our times. It exacerbates all other types of insecurity and all other types of oppression, and makes it really hard to find public solutions and even private solutions for the challenges that we face. I also believe, having studied the data and having listened to researchers that are a lot smarter than me and talking to people on the ground, that there are not enough jobs as a structural rather than a contingent fact. It's not a contingent fact that we have an unemployment problem. It's a structural reality that the very nature of work, the very nature of the economy is changing. And Commonomics USA is one of many organizations trying to find solutions, practical solutions to those types of problems. I also feel like work is often talked about as a moral obligation, and we're going to discuss that a little bit in terms of the case for basic income. We tend to sort of metaphysicalize the concept of work and the concept of responsibility, even though sometimes our economic realities don't necessarily reflect that type of value system. that we're trying to put forth. And so I think the conversation about basic income, universal support, is also asks, I think, a very deep question about work. And it's something that I hear from people in all walks of life almost all the time. And that is, most people don't feel like the economy they live in and the work they do really reflects their value system, and that there's a growing realization or a growing feeling that we need to do something about that. I want to say, before I get started, I want to bring to everyone's attention the dates, May 12th through 15th of 2016, because that is when an event is going to take place up in Winnipeg, and it is the North American Basic Income Guarantee Congress, the North American Basic Income Guarantee Congress of 2016. And again, that is taking place May 12th through the 15th of 2016 on the campus of the University of Manitoba. And it is sponsored by, and the group that you can visit, the site that you can visit to learn more about that is basicincomecanada.org. That's basicincomecanada.org. That is the North American Basic Income Guarantee Congress that is taking place May 12th through the 15th of this year. So you can get more information there. I want to give a shout out right at the top of this and also make you aware of this site. This is the group Basic Income Action, which is just basicincomeaction.org, basicincomeaction.org. They contacted me before this presentation, said they were very happy that we were doing this, very happy that Commonomics USA and Materialized Empathy have taken up the cause. And Commonomics USA is a partnership-based organization. We work with other organizations. That's the reason for our existence. And Materialized Empathy aims to craft policies based on what entire movements plan together. And so that organization and other basic income organizations, both in the United States and worldwide, are very important in being part of that coalition. And so I want to, again, draw everyone's attention to basicincomeaction.org, particularly if you have deeper questions about basic income than we are able to cover today. That group is absolutely the group that you want to be talking to. So thanks to everyone there. Commonomics USA is Mark Armstrong, Susan Harmon, Chong Ki Tan, Maikwe Ludwig, and myself. Maikwe and I also started the Materialized Empathy Project to articulate legal and policy solutions based on empathy and solidarity and based on the commons and the notion of the commons. The question of how communities produce and distribute material well-being is a deeply intimate question. Our economy is our shared materiality. It influences our personal relationships, our self-care, and our social care. There are tendencies in the economy that are in tension. On the one hand, we extract and exploit from the earth and from each other. On the other hand, we cooperate, and we are capable of acts of projects of collective greatness. But too many of our laws and too many of our policies favor the extraction and exploitation tendency over the cooperative tendency. The solutions to that imbalance, as we'll see today, are not always left-wing or right-wing solutions. We'll see that the basic income solution is something that is advocated totally across the ideological and political spectrum, including on the right. Many solutions are local, and we concern ourselves at Commonomics USA with a lot of those local solutions. But there are a couple of issues that need to be resolved at a larger level, and we believe the question of universal income is mostly a national issue. Although, as we will talk about towards the end of the presentation, there are local conduits and local means by which some types of basic income programs could be and should be implemented, particularly through intentional communities and other specially dedicated communities. And so we'll talk about that. But as my colleagues at Commonomics USA have repeatedly reminded me, the reason that basic income presents itself, manifests itself as a national issue has to do with the likelihood that if you only did basic income in a particular community or only did basic income guarantees in a particular state, that may likely cause regional imbalances and disruptive migrations to places where support was available, away from places where support was not available. That might not always happen. It doesn't happen in the status quo with a lot of entitlement programs or support programs that are available in some places and not others. But something as significant as the implementation of basic support income would surely have a significant effect on migration if it was not available everywhere. Now, I think that while we can debate what basic income looks like, and we'll talk about that when we get to the what, why, and how universal it can actually be and where it comes from, I believe basic income is an important consideration because it reflects an acknowledgement of our shared materiality. I've talked about this a little bit before, but for decades, well-funded think tanks of individualism have been telling us that we don't really share this planet, that our fates are not really bound together materially. Of course, we disagree with that, and we believe that science and economics and religion are all converging right now to push us into the direction of realizing that we do share that commonality. The disproportionate effect of global climate change and our invariably inequitable responses to that also raise questions of social support and dividends, which is, of course, a key proposal of the Citizens Climate Lobby, a movement that both Maikwe and I have sat down and done some work with on several occasions. A carbon fee and dividend is a cousin of the basic income proposal. I think that that synthesis is worth paying attention to, and I'd love for those movements to dialogue and converge. I will inevitably leave some things out of this presentation. Things like Tobin taxes, sin taxes, taxing undesirable things and then paying off people in a dividend through that. That's related to carbon fees, for example. There are other tax plans. I am not going to get into real detail about the financial transaction tax, which some people have said is one way that we could supplement our public budgets in order to do things like pay basic income or pay dividends. I'm not going to be able to cover the taxes, so that's another conversation to be had. There's also no bells and whistles in this presentation. There's no graphics at this point. The notes I'm reading from will be available after this presentation on the Commonomics website. Materialized Empathy is in its development stage. We're still fundraising. We have great videographers and graphic designers who want to work with us. They're willing to offer us reasonable rates because we're so cool. But we are still in that development stage. If you like what you've heard today, please consider making a donation to Commonomics USA, which I will talk about a little bit at the end of the presentation, but I obviously will not belabor the point. So for the what, let's begin with the what of what basic income is. There are several different types of income distribution systems that are designed either to be universal or to fill in the gaps created by poverty and inequality. On the universal side is the universality of basic income, and that is what people typically say. They might call it a UBI. They may call it some other things, but in terms of terminology, we could call it unconditional basic income or universal basic income. Both of those things obviously UBI. All residents Under some proposals, only citizens, but let's say all residents receive an unconditional sum of money on a periodic basis from public institutions, a sum of money sufficient to at least ameliorate or minimize the impact of income inequality, temporary unemployment periods, basic insecurity, etc. But everyone gets it. And that is the crux of basic income. And both the means of that and the universality of that are distinguished from a few other things that I'll mention very briefly. There is the social dividend, which could be a form of basic income. And Alaska does this. Everyone receives a periodic regular payout from a profitable activity that the government facilitates and or benefits from. That would be a social dividend. Alaska does this. A carbon fee and dividend system or any other system that puts fees on or taxes behavior that we want to discourage would do that. A third type of income distribution is guaranteed minimum income, which sounds like basic income, but it's not universal. It's means-tested, regular financial support, and not everyone is going to get it. A fourth concept is the concept of a negative income tax, That is a radically progressive income tax system where people earning below a certain amount receive supplemental pay from the government instead of paying taxes to the government. Even though we have small versions of that in some of our tax systems around the world, like the earned income tax credit and things like that, it's not something that has been implemented on a full-scale comprehensive level. However, Milton Friedman, the great free market economist who was also a proponent of basic income, universal basic income, he also was a proponent of the negative income tax. And under his proposal, people with no earned income would receive a refundable tax credit or a negative tax sufficient to live on. As their income rose, the amount of credit would fall by some set percentage of earned income. Once the credit fell to zero, they'd start paying income taxes on any additional earnings that they earned after that. That was Friedman's proposal. But he also was a fan of simply universal basic income, as was Friedrich Hayek, another free market economist. There are some other terms and other policies that we may be discussing or that may be distinguished from either methodologically or policy-wise from basic income, such as dedicated citizens accounts, in which either when you're born or when you're a few years old, the state, the government starts a set-up savings account for you and gives it to you when you reach legal age. And that is something that people have also proposed for many years. People have proposed that. Now, I want to spend a little time when we're in this what section distinguishing, again, unconditional basic income, universal basic income from a guaranteed minimum income. I think we know the difference between it. One is means tested and scalable and progressive. The other one obviously is universal for everybody. But the reason that proponents of a universal basic income believe that it is superior to a guaranteed minimum income is worth getting into a little bit. Excuse me. That argument is that the lack of a means test or similar administration and all of the bureaucracy that is necessary for some type of graduated or progressive system would allow for some savings on social welfare, which could be put towards the basic grant. And so the same reason that basic income, which we'll talk about in a little while, replaces a lot of the means-tested welfare systems under these proposals, is also the reason why it would be preferred over a guaranteed minimum income. And that is, just give it to everybody, don't pay extra to have to administrate the means tests, etc. There are lots of other reasons why it's important for it to be universal, but we're going to talk about incentives, we're going to talk about other things, but that is the main policy reason why a guaranteed income for everyone is preferable, at least by its proponents, is preferable to the method of graduated or progressive taxation that becomes negative taxation. Many countries are and have in the past experimented, some on small scales, some are about to experiment on very large scales, some are about to vote. So many countries around the world have for a few years now and are continuing to experiment with and test the waters of universal basic income. The Bolsa Familia program in Brazil, the partial basic income program over in Macau. There is a basic income program that has been tried in Iran. Basic income pilot programs have been conducted in some communities in the United States and Canada. There's research available that I believe favors, for the most part, the implementation of those programs. And those experiments were actually done in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And so that data is both old, but also has been around for a while. So it's something that people can see and consider. Namibia, India, and several countries in Europe have considered and have piloted programs. There are political decisions in France, the Netherlands, and Finland to start up some form of basic income pilots over the next dispensation. Switzerland will hold a referendum this year on a basic income program to provide every Swiss citizen with an unconditional grant of 2,500 Swiss francs per month. And for those of us in the United States, 2,500 Swiss francs is about $2,800, about $2,800. So those are programs that are coming into being. Obviously, those things are going to be on the ground, and there's going to be some data points that we in the United States can learn from as we try to build some kind of basic income movement here. And so to summarize, in terms of what it is, it's the universal granting to be distinguished from other programs that either means test or progressively graduate up and down, like a negative income tax. And there are various ways to fund it, but the bottom line is that if it's UBI, the U can stand for either universal or unconditional, and the idea is that everyone gets it. Let's move to the why. I want to kind of spend an adequate amount of time talking about the why, because the world is not full of economic and policy wonks. I think the economic reasons for doing something like this are very good, and we'll talk about that in terms of the why. But people also are concerned about policies and lifestyles that cohere with their value system. At least they would like to be. They would like to take that into consideration. And so I think the moral arguments are important. And I think that the most sweeping and often least discussed benefit to a basic income program, to a program where wealth is, some level of wealth is given to people unconditionally on a regular basis, is the value that is generated through improved individual, environmental, and community health. And this is something, it bears repeating: individual health, community health, environmental health, all are enhanced by programs that decrease economic inequality and decrease economic insecurity. Poverty makes us sick. It decreases productivity and creativity. It makes us die sooner. It has a lot of deleterious effects. The other day I wrote something that resonated with a lot of people when I posted it, and so I'm going to read it now. In America, at least, if you're poor, you die earlier, you live an exponentially more stressful life, you spend money on everyday necessities, more money on everyday necessities than others do. If I am poor, I often have untreated mental illness. I am more likely to be abused by a partner. I am less likely to be able to escape that abusive partner. Those of us who are poor face public service discrimination, lack of access to cheap financial services. We are forced to eat really unhealthy food rather than not eat at all. And many of us, up to 50% of us right now, can't survive or would not be able to survive a $500 emergency. Those of us who are poor will probably die before we retire. We are surrounded, if we're poor, by toxins and pollutants. We lack access to basic legal services and are thus more likely to get hurt by courts, landlords, and bosses. We, above all, if we're poor, we cannot afford to engage in the very political process that makes it easier for all of those horrible things to happen to us. Now, the reversal of that fortune for those of us who are poor would not just be a moral good, although I believe it would be a moral good, but it would also be a material, economic, health, and quality of life good. It would make society more competitive in the most positive senses of the term. But none of those facts lead automatically to supporting universal basic income. It may be possible, some say, to eliminate poverty without it. So as we continue the discussion, listen for ways in which the universality of basic income may or may not be necessary to solve the particular problems it purports to solve. But also listen for the ways in which the failure to make basic income universal undermines its effectiveness, including in the area most often argued against public wealth distribution, which is incentives. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about the incentives objection and how the universality of universal basic income actually serves as a very good answer to the incentives objection. But the reason that we need to include those health and quality of life indicators is that conventional economists tend to individualize the value of income distribution. The social benefits or deficits of income can be measured, and measurement is arbitrary and incomplete by nature, but nevertheless, it articulates something. I want to talk also about the why in terms of various political positions, particularly on one side, the progressive case or the social democratic or left case for basic income, and on the other side, the right, conservative, and very much libertarian and free market case for universal basic income. The progressive and social democratic and maybe even socialist case for basic income actually goes all the way back to Thomas Paine, one of the most famous agitators of the American Revolution. Paine favored basic income in the form of what he called capital grants at the age of majority. Why? he had some very philosophical and political reasons for doing so. They had to do with something that is very much in line with the philosophy of Commonomics USA, which is the social nature of wealth and the social nature of the commons. Paine wrote, "Poverty is a thing created by that which is called civilized life. It exists not in the natural state. On the other hand, the natural state is without those advantages which flow from agriculture, arts, science, and manufactures, organized society. It is a position," he wrote, "not to be controverted, that the earth in its natural cultivated state was and ever would have continued to be the common property of the human race." Now, of course, many on our side would rightly object to conceiving of the commons of the earth as everyone's property. And a better conception would simply be to say that the commons is the source of all our providence or all our sustenance and wealth, and we're part of that system, the natural part of it, and the parts we build out of it. That reconception doesn't change Paine's point. It might even strengthen it. A similar argument today is made by feminist economist Elisa McKay, who has argued for a basic income as a tool for promoting gender-neutral social citizenship rights. And so that's the left case. I'm not going to spend more time on that because I want to talk about the conservative case. I am assuming that probably most of our listeners are on one side and not the other of a particular political spectrum. I apologize. I don't mean to marginalize those who are on the other side, but I want to talk about the conservative case because I think it's very important to build bridges on this issue. As Noah Gordon pointed out in an article 2 years ago, smart conservatives have for a long time favored the efficiency and decentralization of benefits rather than their outright elimination. So while the conservative narrative is largely anti-benefits, anti-social dividend, kind of the more forward-thinking people in the conservative movement have seen the decentralization and the less complicated management of those benefits as a good middle ground for them to stake out on the question of benefits. Even Florida Senator Marco Rubio had a plan at one time that would move most of America's existing welfare funding into flex funds to be distributed to states. We can debate about whether those are good or bad ideas. What I want to latch onto is the fact that those are ideas that seek to simplify the manner of distribution of goods. Paul Ryan of Wisconsin, partly inspired by the universal credit reforms of Britain's conservative government, proposed allowing states to combine several different forms of federal anti-poverty funding into a single funding stream. These are old ideas. As I mentioned before, Friedrich Hayek, who is a free market theorist, endorsed basic income. In 1962, libertarian economist Milton Friedman did the same, advocated a minimum guaranteed income via negative income tax, but also went on to favor what he called helicopter drops of money into the economy, just giving people direct money. Now, in 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. said the solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income. It's not totally clear whether he meant a negative income tax or a basic income. Richard Nixon tried to pass a negative income tax a few years later. And in 1972, George McGovern, who was running against Richard Nixon, also suggested a guaranteed annual income. Charles Murray, who is not very popular on the left, advocates eliminating all welfare transfer programs, including Social Security and Medicare, and substituting an annual $10,000 cash grant to everyone 21 years of age and older. Of course, Their argument is that such plans would decrease bureaucracy and the expense of means testing and behavioral enforcement, etc., and all of the different things that are necessary to administer the distribution of income now. As one comment on one article that I read said, for libertarians, basic income is also a wedge to hammer home a more free and competitive market in the future by eliminating the number one objection to free markets, which is the effect of poverty. There is also the case according to technology. Now we get back into economics a little bit more, but I think also we're going to see how that economic case comes full circle to the moral case again. In the Financial Times in February of 2014, Martin Wolf contemplated a guaranteed income's ability to help society adjust to the disappearance of low-skill, low-wage jobs. Similarly, studies by MIT economists have yielded the conclusion that we are simply at a stage right now where further technological progress is not going to create new jobs. It is probably going to eliminate jobs. According to Nathan Schneider at Vice magazine, the idea of basic income has been appearing among the tech bro elite, and they call it that. That's funny. One investor recently told New York Magazine that he considers it a very interesting idea. Sam Altman of Y Combinator calls its implementation an obvious conclusion. And Albert Wegner, who is a venture capitalist in New York, has been blogging about basic income since 2013. He's worried about the effect that his company and other companies are going to have on the economy, which when they do things like teach languages to machines and hail cars and all of those things will displace jobs. And so Wegner said, we are at the beginning of the time when machines will do a lot of the things humans have traditionally done. How do you avoid a massive bifurcation of society into those who have wealth and those who do not? Now, somewhat related to this is, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, the idea of work, changing conceptions of work. You could even call it the case against work. Our work norms are held up as natural and normal, heaven sent, sensible, universal, ahistorical. We are expected to work. But as automation suggests, as the evolution of work hours and battles over work hours over the last 100 years suggest, work is not a fixed or uncontested concept. Given the coming impact of climate change, the need to shift the way that we operate major industrial and economic sectors, the possibility of shifts to local production on top of automation, and automation can itself be scaled and localized as well, we may be moving into a norm of a 40-hour week becoming a 30-hour week, a 30-hour week becoming a 20-hour week, and so on, and where those types of things are going to be feasible. This interacts in interesting ways with the incentives debate, the debate about incentives. A materially empathetic approach to policy would probably reframe incentives as a focal point of discussion. And as we move into technologies that eliminate the necessity of work, the extraction and exploitation economy wants to find ways to keep people working or punish them for not working, even though the collective economy and the technology that it supports have moved us on and pushed us past that point. Because, of course, that surplus work would become surplus value and surplus profit. Basic income serves as a kind of normative and material check on that notion that even though the necessity of work is changing, we still want you to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week. Basic income checks that. It says, normatively and materially, people don't have to stay in work situations that are not necessary. People don't have to stay in work situations that are harmful to them, or even that they don't want to do. It sends a message that working is not a prerequisite for being a citizen and living a citizen's life or a residential life. And so look for those arguments as well to be a big part of the conversation. We're rapidly moving to the point where technology is going to scale down the amount of human labor that's going to have to be involved. And so, will certain forces try to continue to extract surplus labor from people, or can we reconceptualize the notion of work and pay out that dividend, share that dividend of labor out to everyone through a basic income program? So that's another reason that is both an economic and kind of moral case also for basic income. There is also the it's better than the status quo case, simply that it's better than what we have now. Existing support policies in the United States do not work in terms of distributing income where income needs to be distributed to decrease poverty and inequality. So those existing support policies don't work. Ed Dolan, who's a writer, an economic writer, talks about basic income, cites research from, among others, my buddy Elaine Mogg, who some of you know, and the work that she's doing at the Tax Policy Center and with her colleagues. And Ed Dolan concludes the following about the current system. The existing income support system of the United States seems to combine some of the worst features of the stylized alternatives we illustrated earlier. They are not fully effective despite their considerable cost. They leave some 16% of the population below the official poverty threshold. They are not tightly targeted. In an effort to maintain work incentives, many of them provide reduction rates for multiple programs. Many households, especially those just above and below the poverty level, face cliffs and high effective marginal tax rates that undermine incentives to work. Finally, the complexity of many programs, each run by its own bureaucracy, results in a very high administrative expense. Again, that is the work of Ed Dolan, who the citations of which will be available after the presentation. Let's talk a little bit about why not. Let's talk a little bit about the arguments against basic income. I'm not going to spend as much time talking about those as the arguments for, but I want everyone to know what they are. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but there are a few. One is affordability. And of course, this begs the question of how we pay for it. And that's the objection. How are we going to pay for this? Now, obviously, the libertarian argument says if we eliminate the bureaucracy of the welfare system, estimates ranging from the availability of between 10 and 25 or even more thousands of dollars will be available to households or individuals after that elimination. And so that would simply be the way that it would be paid for. But in terms of pure statistics, again, Ed Dolan, quoting Ed Dolan, he estimates that providing a grant to each individual that was sufficient to bring a family of 3 above our assumed $20,000 poverty line would require payments or tax credits roughly of 10% of GDP, 10% of our gross domestic product. But again, it would likely replace existing programs. So the affordability question really has to be deferred until we decide how we're going to pay for it, what we're replacing with basic income, and where that dividend or where that income source will come from. I'll give you a hint. It doesn't have to be redistribution. It doesn't have to be other people's tax money. There are monetary policy-oriented ways, public banking-oriented ways in which that income could be generated. That is actually something that the incoming or the soon-to-be incoming British Labour government, if everything goes the way they think it's going to go, of Jeremy Corbyn, is considering, is contemplating this idea of quantitative easing for the people, and we'll talk about that when we get to the how. Other objections, incentives. Now I want to talk about incentives, the objection of incentives. The incentive objection basically comes down to people need not only the promise of economic reward, but the threat of economic insecurity to work hard. Remember that, because the only logical form of the incentives argument at this level would be that you have to include that component of insecurity as a stick, not just a carrot. People would still be rewarded for hard work, obviously, in a system where everyone received a supplement to whatever work income they did. Since, at least in the conventional sense, no basic income proposal includes giving people $55,000, $60,000, $75,000 a year to live on, the idea is that that basic income is probably going to supplement other income. If that's true, then the incentives argument really only sensibly works the other way, which says it's not enough for you to want additional rewards to work hard. You also need to be scared that you're going to become economically insecure if you don't work. But Ed Dolan, again, writes something very interesting about that. He says, basic income would provide substantial work incentives because there's no reduction of benefits as earned income rises. It would avoid the problems of cliffs and high effective marginal tax rates for low-income households and second earners. And so if you're familiar with economic jargon, it also would have an income effect on labor, but not a substitution effect on labor, unlike current income support programs, which typically have both. And so the incentives argument really goes away in many ways once you make basic income universal. People will still be rewarded for their work and they will not be discouraged from working hard. But remember also what we said earlier about the changing nature of work. I think the changing nature of work and the way that we reconceptualize a work week in the future is also going to influence the way we talk about incentives and having a debate about incentives. There's also the argument that redistribution is immoral and undesirable. Basic income doesn't have to be redistributive, but even if it is, I'm not going to get into the argument about whether it's immoral or undesirable to redistribute income, because that would be an entirely additional video, and we don't have time for that. I'm happy to engage in that dialogue with anyone on an individual level, but suffice it to say that certainly at least half of the ideological spectrum in this country doesn't believe that it's necessarily or intrinsically immoral to redistribute wealth. There is the inflation argument, which says that when we pump more money into the economy, that can cause inflation or hyperinflation. That's not really how hyperinflation especially works. Pulling people away from the kind of economic insecurity that makes them not spend any money will not be more inflationary, or at least not hyperinflationary. And I would refer everyone to the work of Ellen Brown, my colleague at the Public Banking Institute, on those questions, as well as to the debate that's occurring in Britain right now as the impending future Labour government of Jeremy Corbyn considers quantitative easing for the people. There is the argument that there is no political will to make this happen, and I think that there is an emerging political will that we're seeing around the world, but again, I think that that is true of many proposals, and that is that the question of how we make it happen, how we grow the political consciousness to make it happen, is really almost a separate question from the virtue or the solvency of the idea. Remember also that most arguments against a universal basic income are probably also arguments against many other types of support. Now, there are some good arguments and defenses of means testing and the idea that we don't want to, why should we want to give a basic income grant to someone that didn't need it? But again, those are things that we can talk about at another time. The last section that I have is the how section, and then we will see if anybody has questions or comments. The obvious first question, or the obvious first answer to the how question is, if we again take the libertarian argument for basic income seriously, we know that ending means testing and would at least allow for the providing of income to those who needed it. It's not as clear that ending the current system of welfare would allow us to give everybody money, or at least very much money, but then there would be other means to generating that income as well. Taxation, of course, is limited by political will, but in the United States, but taxation is the basis for experiments in various countries and for various conversations. I said I wasn't going to get deeply into taxation, but the notion of a financial transaction tax is one way to do that. There's also a whole different world of taxation in the movement for a land value tax, You may have heard of followers of Henry George and the land value tax movement. And of course, that is taxing the actual value of land, which is not taxed right now, which would generate just huge amounts of income across the board. And proponents of that plan, are right in about the way that ownership right now, land ownership right now, locks value and growth into the hands of very few people. And Thomas Paine was an early proponent of a land value tax even before Henry George was. And of course, the work of Henry George in the 19th century is integral to understanding the concept of a land value tax as a possible way to nationally implement basic income. Then there is the method of democratization of money itself, and the way in which a democratized monetary system would use the creation process of money and value in the service of basic income. That's been called quantitative easing for the people. We know, for example, that when the Federal Reserve bailed out the banks in 2008, that they literally created that $3.5 trillion out of thin air. Doing so, the consensus of economic analysis is that while doing so didn't necessarily improve the economy, it also did not cause some kind of runaway economic disaster. We know that banks do not simply lend their deposits. We know that banks, and particularly central banks, create value through their financial transactions and through the act of lending money. We know that the Fed can quantitatively ease and, again, essentially create that money. Now, those types of solutions are highly controversial. However, they happen. They already happen in the status quo, and they're not having those deleterious effects that people say that they are going to have. And again, I would refer you to the work of Ellen Brown and others who call for a more robust implementation of those kinds of policies. And one manifestation of those types of policies could be the partial supplementation of a basic dividend, basic or a dividend income, or basically an allowance that is given to people across the board. So those things could happen through simply changing monetary policy. Then there is the last thing that I want to get to before we take questions, which I promised to get to. I had said earlier that one of the facets of the basic income discussion is that we assume that this is going to happen on a national level, that it has to happen on a national level because people would migrate to places where it was happening if it wasn't happening nationally. And some people even say it should happen internationally for the same reason. And of course, we're happy to have that dialogue and bring proponents of some kind of global financial plan to the table as well. But let's assume that we do want to talk about community implementation, basic communities. Many of you who are listening here are advocates, proponents, and sometimes even members of intentional communities. The possibility of community implementation is something that could be an exception to the idea that this needs to be universal. Intentional communities, some of which already share income, have the right to approve membership, and so that might solve the migration problem. And because of that, a basic income schema could be developed, and integration could be managed. So an intentional community might quantitatively ease its members through an internal currency. That's one thing that could happen, although it would need to do so judiciously. An intentional community could obviously make people pay in and distribute out. And an intentional community could do that through not only direct money transfers, but also by combining that money with basic material shares, programs of goods and services rather than simply money. They could even utilize time banking and other barter systems, most of which could really only be implemented locally. And once we know that intentional communities could do that, then it is also possible for municipalities or other collective bodies to do that. And again, the only question at that point becomes an integrative question. How do we absorb or control increases in the number of stakeholders in order to avoid being overwhelmed in that instance? And that might not be possible. That might be an unsolvable problem, but it is, in my opinion, a problem that should be brought to the table, because I do think that there are ways in which at least intentional communities right now, many already share income. There are also ways in which communities, even that don't share income, could implement basic income types of pilot programs. And so, like many economic justice issues, the issue of basic income has national implications, and it also has local implications. And like many issues about economic justice, we are only beginning to form a lot of the opinions and analyze a lot of the data. However, even though certainly none of the current major party presidential candidates have talked about this idea, probably their advisors have said that it would be toxic, even if they've contemplated it at all. So even though it is not on the radar of that portion of the national political conversation, if you Google basic income, or even if you put basic income into a Google News search for United States stories, you will see that once again, for the last couple of years, and in many cases for the last several years, people all across the political spectrum in the United States and elsewhere are talking about this idea. And it's going to be very interesting to see, particularly Finland, implementing the idea as an experiment starting this year, Switzerland, or starting to phase in the idea of basic income, Switzerland having a referendum about whether or not to adopt basic income. Those are things that we're going to want to watch, because if something is happening in another country, it's not completely unfeasible that it would happen here. And if more and more policymakers get a sense of the long-term effects of structural unemployment, structural inequality, the deindustrialization of our industrial base, the changing nature of work, the Uberization of the economy, and the growing social consequences of economic insecurity, I believe that basic income will have a seat at policy meetings in the future. And we at Commonomics USA and many other organizations, especially Basic Income Action, are going to do our best to make sure that that conversation takes place. So I hope that this has been this overview, which I know has had a lot of facts and a lot of ideas and a lot of words. I hope that it's been helpful. I will post the notes to this presentation at the Commonomics USA website. I will also link them out on various social networks, with some of which you may be familiar with in terms of me. Right now, I want to see if we have any questions. And I'm going to begin by looking at the question thread on the event page on our Facebook page. So going ahead and looking at that now. I'm not seeing any questions there. I'm going to go ahead and see if we have any questions in our Q&A queue. I'm testing that now. So I'm not seeing any questions right now, but if you want to type a question, we'll stay on for a few more minutes. And while we are on, what I would like to do is I would like to go ahead and tell everyone very quickly about Commonomics USA. And if you would like to support us, if you enjoyed this presentation, if you think we need more presentations like this, if you would like to increase our production value, then go ahead and go to commonomicsusa.org, and you will see a menu item for membership. So commonomicsusa.org, you'll see a menu item for membership, and it allows you to either become an ongoing supporter or do a one-time donation to Commonomics USA. There are also ways in which will be made available to you in terms of supporting the Materialized Empathy Project in particular. But there are many ways to donate to our organization and support our organization, and we certainly appreciate that. So one listener, one audience member says, have you given any consideration to what an appropriate level for basic income ought to be, and whether that level should be tied to the concept of individuals, households, families, or some other unit? And that is a very important question. And in fact, that was a question that I was debating about whether or not to include in the description today, as I was rushing through over the last several days the plethora of basic income literature. Do we contemplate that grant being per household? Do we contemplate, and then of course those questions, those other qualification questions. And obviously if it's a universal question, if we're talking about giving it to everyone, then we're not going to means test. As far as the floor and ceiling of it, the assumption of the authors that I read on this is that we want to make it enough so that we can meaningfully eliminate at least the effects of poverty. And as far as the household versus individual, the best arguments that I've heard in that discussion favor giving it to individuals when they reach the legal age of maturity, as opposed to focusing on families. The reason for that is that some of the basic personal security that is provided from a basic income grant would be necessary to give them to the individuals, and the whether individuals wish to combine their income would be up to them. But the paradigm case, and this goes back into kind of the moral case for basic income, is the idea of a family member who wants to escape from an abusive situation. And so that is, that is a reason why, we would not want to give it to the whole family. Now, as far as contemplating whether we should calculate income in terms of families versus individuals, if that's the question, I don't have an answer for that question, but I'm betting that our friends at Basic Income Action would have an answer for that question as to whether the best way to calculate these grants would be in terms of family size versus individuals. My answer is going to tend to be, until I hear better, that we should always talk about giving the individual money if they are of legal age, and that also if the means to give out grants to younger people would not include, we would not want to include any kind of means of having, the parents or having other family members control that money. We want each individual to control that income security for reasons of unrighteous dominion, abuse, granting people individual choice, those types of reasons. I'm going to go ahead and see if we have any other questions. And it looks like right now we don't have any other questions. But what I would like you to do, and what I would like you to keep in mind, is that you can write some questions on the Facebook page itself for the event page. You can also email me. My email is matt@commonomicsusa.org. That's matt@commonomicsusa.org. If you have further questions or comments, or would like to be part of the dialogue, or would like to volunteer. And again, I want to draw everyone's attention to Basic Income Action, basicincomeaction.org, for answers to questions that I have not been able to answer for you. I hope I haven't confused you about anything, but if there are questions that you want to have deeper discussions about this, those are folks that we want to bring to the table as well. And I fully expect that we will be having discussions with them in our Materialized Empathy podcasts in the future. Once again, I hope that this has been informative for you. I want to wish everyone love and solidarity, and thank you very much for your support of this project and support of our projects and our organization in general. Together, we really can overcome this very brutal world of material inequality and material and environmental insecurity that we face right now. And the solution for that is to work with grassroots organizations and individuals who have these ideas and translate those ideas into public deliberation, law, and policy. And that's what we're doing at Commonomics USA and the Materialized Empathy Project. And again, I want to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions via email or other forms of messaging anytime after this presentation. Everyone have a great weekend, and thanks again.